Okay, let's take a look at that KD ratio. It's actually gone down. It went down from 215 to 213. It's because I've been playing a lot of Conquest. I've been trying to fly as much as I could in helicopters. There was a couple videos that are really good. One of the guys, Wolfinator, I've played with him before. He didn't think he was a good pilot, but damn man, we were doing some damage. So anyways, when you're flying, you tend to die a lot and don't get a high kill count. So the KD ratio went down. This video is the fourth in the money series. The first being money, what it is, and how inflation works. The second one was about the tax system, both for individuals and corporations. The third one was how to make money. The first two are kind of, and I mentioned this in a podcast. You should watch those so you understand how, what we're talking about with money. But they're not necessary. This one is the fourth in the series, and we're going to be talking about international money and the money systems, the monetary system, and the wars that have been fought to preserve it. In particular, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and the War on Terror. So I don't want to, like I said, the podcast alone is 35 minutes. I'm going to keep this introduction short. I'm not going to show the merch. I'd appreciate it if you buy some. I've only sold one thing. Ed, thank you. Get out there and support this channel. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you know a veteran that fought in those wars, he may be interested in hearing this. Please share it with him. So without further ado, let's get this thing rolling. You're listening to the Raging SeaBears podcast. This podcast is a culmination of years of research, and I've been thinking about putting it together for the past month, and I've actually been working on it for the past week. I've listened and re-listened to it. I've added and removed comments that either flowed better or removed things where I spun off onto a tangent that it really didn't hammer the point home. But when I've listened to it, as I've gone over this, I find that my voice is very monotone. This is not an emotional rant. This is more of a research project, and I'm dumping data. Times, dates, people, companies that have been involved in the wars in the Middle East that protracted the wars out to, 20 years? 19 years and change? So I apologize in advance if it's a little monotone and isn't entertaining. A voice actor, I am not. What you're about to hear is all verifiable. Feel free to double check my sources. I've even tried to double check them myself using ChatGPT and Grok, and I've always been substantiated. In fact, I encourage you to read all the books that I list at the end of this recording to learn yourself, right? Dig in, do your own research. Unlike the commenters who like to express their opinions and then call me ignorant because I don't agree with them, I am providing researchable materials. So with that said, let's get this thing rolling. In this, the fourth rant about money, we're going to talk about money and the wars that it has created in the later part of the 20th century and into the 21st century. As preface to this podcast, I would ask that you at least watch the first two parts of Money, the series, that are on YouTube. They are not on a podcast per se, but they are on YouTube. The audio is fair. I was having some issues with a headphone mic, but I think they are important. The first one talks about what is money and inflation and how the whole system works. The second one covers the tax system in the United States and how it is applied to individuals as well as corporations. The third one is optional, not necessarily for the understanding of this podcast, but it is how to make money. So in this one, I want to cover the wars that money has caused in the 20th century and for the first part of the 21st century. And in order to understand this, we have to understand the system that created these issues. And it goes back to World War II. when the war was breaking out, when Adolf Hitler and the Nazis were marching through Europe and the Imperial Japanese were marching across Asia, the countries of the world shipped their gold reserves to the United States to keep it out of the fascist regime's grasp. So that by the end of the war, by the end of World War II, 75 to 80% of the world's gold reserves sat in the United States. Further, the United States was the only economic power in the world that was pretty much left unscathed. Our industrial might was at its peak. Europe was rubble. Japan was rubble. China was still in its infancy. In terms of industrialization, they were still a powerhouse when it comes to manpower. So, in July 22nd of 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement was founded. And what the Bretton Woods Agreement did was basically establish a world economic system that was based on the US dollar as the reserve. And the dollar was anchored to gold at $35 an ounce. Then the other nations of the world, whether it was Britain, France, Germany, Japan, whatever, would hold US dollars in their banks as their local reserves rather than repatriating the gold itself back from the United States. So then, based on the number of dollars they had in their central bank, at some ratio, they would then print local currencies. So, the British would print pounds based on how many dollars they had in their central bank, and France would print, francs based on how many dollars they had in their central bank, and same with Germany and Russia and Japan, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so this established a stable monetary system for the world to rebuild after World War II. So time progresses, and the 1960s come about. The United States enters the Vietnam War. President Johnson takes over after the Kennedy assassination on November 22nd, 1963, and he launches the war on poverty. And not just the war on poverty, but the war in Vietnam as well. And through the war on poverty and Vietnam, Johnson starts basically spending more money than the United States had in its treasury. And so we started printing money. We started inflating the money supply. Now, in 1968, French President de Gaulle discovers that the United States we were basically cheating on the Bretton Woods Agreement, in that we were printing dollars without gold in Fort Knox. This would be the equivalent of Ford or General Motors selling car titles but no cars to go with them. So he actually went on the air, and you can watch this on YouTube, look it up. French President de Gaulle, 1968, announces to the world that the United States was cheating on the Bretton Woods Agreement, and basically told the world to recall their gold, right? Repatriate their gold, bring the gold back from the United States, because we were cheating. And countries of the world started doing that. In fact, it accelerated, so much so that by 1971, the United States found itself in a position of default. This forced President Nixon in August of 1971 to take the United States off the international gold standard, thereby decoupling the dollar from gold at $35 an ounce. Now, this had a couple of effects. One, the value of gold skyrocketed, and number two, by 1973, the world currencies had transitioned into a floating exchange rate system and away from that gold standard, away from the Bretton Woods Agreement. So the Bretton Woods Agreement died. Well, this actually threw the United States into a terrible recession, where we actually went into double-digit inflation. I mean, true double-digit inflation. So much so, I remember that in December of 1979, my father bought a house and assumed the mortgage at 12% interest and was happy to get it. Think of that about today, where we're sitting at 6% and people are losing their minds. Anyway, the dollar was quickly being removed as the world reserve currency. And I didn't define what a world reserve currency. Basically, the world reserve currency is that currency which the world recognizes as a stable medium of exchange that can be used universally for the settlement of debts and for trade balance. So that was quickly going away, and that would endanger the American economy. Now, Nixon's Secretary of State was Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger had this idea that if they could make an agreement with Saudi Arabia to agree that oil would only be sold in U.S. dollars, that it would bolster the dollar as a reserve currency. And so that agreement was made. Basically, Saudi Arabia, and by extension OPEC, agreed that only dollars would be used for the purchase of oil. And in exchange, Saudi Arabia, the House of Saud, was guaranteed its sovereignty by the might of the United States military. Further, it was agreed that the vast amount of money that would be flowing into Saudi Arabia and the OPEC nations would then be also invested into United States financial institutions or assets such as treasury bonds, and this was known as Petro-Dollar recycling. This single act created the United States' greatest export. If you were to ask anyone what the United States' greatest export is, the vast majority of people would get it wrong. The number one export of the United States is dollars, U.S. dollars. And that is why we have a trade imbalance. So here's how this works. So China needs oil to run its industrial infrastructure. So they ship us TVs and cheap crap that you find in Walmart or in the bottom of a McDonald's Happy Meal, and we send them dollars, and then they use those dollars and they go buy oil. Or Germany needs dollars to buy oil for its economy and its infrastructure. So it sends us Mercedes and BMWs, and we send them dollars. That's how the international monetary system works. And it's been very stable for a long time. It's actually getting a little interesting right now since the king of Saudi Arabia passed away a number of years ago, and the crown prince is not a fan of the United States, and has actually started moving Saudi Arabia's defense contracts over to Russia and away from the United States. But that's a conversation for another time, about the collapse of the petrodollar, which is also being accelerated by the BRICS nations, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, who are pushing to create an alternative to the dollar for the world reserve currency. And the fact that Joe Biden decided to weaponize the dollar and start seizing assets of foreign dignitaries and foreign quote-unquote oligarchs created a giant question mark in the world's mind about the stability and the security of the dollar. If it can be used against them, if it can be seized and taken away from them, then it is no longer a store of value on the world stage, and an alternative is quickly being sought. And by the way, all of this stuff is available. Look it up. Even if you just type it into ChatGPT or Grok, it's going to tell you what I'm telling you. Now, the exercise of the United States military to protect the sovereignty of the House of Saud was never tried until 1990. August 2nd, 1990 in particular, when Saddam Hussein approached the American ambassador, April Gillespie. And Saddam Hussein asked April what the United States position would be if he were to invade Kuwait. And the response was that the United States had no opinion, and it would be an Arab dispute, and we didn't care. Do what you will. So Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and threatened the border of Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi Arabian king exercised the clause of the petrodollar that the United States guarantee Saudi Arabian sovereignty and the House of Saud, and the United States went to war. This was Desert Shield, Desert Storm. If you've ever wondered why the United States didn't finish the war and remove Saddam Hussein from power at the end of Desert Storm, The reason is simple. We accomplished our strategic goal of defending the border of Saudi Arabia and protected the House of Saud. Saddam Hussein was never a consideration. It was purely a war for the preservation of the petrodollar and the economic security of the United States dollar as the world reserve currency. Period. So time passed, and Iraq was under heavy sanctions as a result of the terms of Desert Storm, and started to sell oil on the black market for gold, using India as a mediator. This was again a threat to the petrodollar. So if you ever wondered why we invaded Iraq after 9/11, it wasn't because of weapons of mass destruction that Secretary of State Colin Powell professed before the United Nations. In fact, this is interesting. Colin Powell resigned as Secretary of State when he found out that he had been duped into lying to the world about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and has never entered politics again as a result. So anyways, the lie that was told to the American people in the world is that we invaded Iraq because they had weapons of mass destruction. Now, the other question you have to ask yourself is, well, why did we invade Afghanistan? Especially given the fact that Osama bin Laden was in Pakistan. Why didn't we invade Pakistan? Why Afghanistan? We invaded Afghanistan for the exact same reasons the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in the 1980s. Because the largest natural gas reserves on the planet are found under the Caspian Sea. And there's only two ways that you can bring that natural gas to market. You're going to have to liquefy it and ship it by ship or by pipeline. And the only way to get it out of that area is through either Iran, and nobody wanted to play with that one, or Afghanistan. This is why the Soviets invaded it, and this is why we invaded it. We invaded Afghanistan to gain access to the natural gas found in the Caspian Sea. In fact, in December of 2001, George Bush declared that the Taliban regime had been removed from power. Then, in May of 2003, Secretary of State Donald Rumsfeld announced the end of major combat in Afghanistan. Why? Because they had secured the regions where the pipeline was to be laid. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, that pipeline was never completed. It was expected to be completed by 2019, but as of this date, it is still uncompleted. As a result, President Trump, under his first term, had decided to withdraw the troops. But it wasn't completed under his administration, and under Biden, we had the botched withdrawal from the Bagram Air Force Base on July 2nd, 2019, resulting in 13 more American service members dying. We gave up in Afghanistan because they couldn't get the pipeline built in a reasonable amount of time. That time being, 18 years? You know, I often wonder, why did they have to lie to the American public? Why don't they just say the truth? Look, our money's tied to oil. And we have to defend our interests, because if the petrodollar collapses, our economy collapses. No, seriously, if the petrodollar collapses, our economy will completely implode. Because without the petrodollar, the United States dollar would lose its world reserve currency status, and all of those tens of trillions of dollars that are offshore, it's called the M3 money supply, would come back to the United States, because it would no longer be needed to purchase oil or to be used for trade imbalances, etc. So if the petrodollar goes, the inflation that would result in the United States would be 4 digits. A number of years ago, I did the math. It was like 2,400% inflation. I'm sure it's worse now, especially with the amount of spending that's going on. So imagine $10,000 for a gallon of milk, right? We're talking a depression that makes 1929 look like a walk in the park with balloons and lollipops. I mean, we're talking the collapse of the American society that we live in. So, that kind of truth, if told to the American people, I think the American people would support putting boots on the ground in order to preserve our way of life. Seriously. I would have no objection to putting boots on the ground to make sure that our economy doesn't totally implode and we have food riots and eating zoo animals, or we start shooting our neighbors because they got a can of beans and we're hungry, because that's what we're be looking at if when this goes. So if you think about it, there have been a lot of wars in history that have been fought for a lot less than preserving a way of life. The Trojan War allegedly was fought over Helen of Troy, right? World War I was fought over the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, which started it off, and the sinking of the Lusitania, which killed 128 Americans, which pulled the Americans into the war. By the way, read that story in Creature from Jekyll Island. There's more to it than that. It was actually tied back to money. Then we actually have silly wars like the Oaken Bucket War of 1325 or the Pig War of 1859, the War of Golden Stool of the 1900, and the latest one, the Soccer War of 1969. So we've gone to war, not the United States, but there have been wars fought throughout time for some really stupid shit. So putting boots on the ground to preserve our way of life, I have no problem with that. Now, with that said, that would justify the Iraq War. Afghanistan, however, is another kettle of fish. There is no reason why American boots should have been on the ground in Afghanistan. We have enough natural gas in this country, up in the Dakotas, the Bakken oil fields, where there used, I'm not sure if it's still going on, but when Biden was in office, they were venting natural gas into the atmosphere because the administration wouldn't let them build the infrastructure to capture it. So the idea of putting boots on the ground to go into Afghanistan in order to secure natural gas, I can't justify it, right? I understand why we did it. I understand the reason why we did it. I cannot justify the reason why we did that, why we put boots on the ground in Afghanistan. Somebody, somebody somewhere pressured George W. for us to put boots on the ground in Afghanistan to secure that natural gas pipeline. In all probability, it was probably Dick Cheney, who was the CEO of Halliburton before he was picked to be vice president. Halliburton, the company that got no-bid contracts to rebuild the oil infrastructure in Iraq after being destroyed by Saddam Hussein or the United States military when we invaded. Along with SLB, which was formerly Schlumberger, Baker Hughes, and National Oil Well Varco. These companies actually use the CIA and the military to basically force governments of the world to contract for energy construction, whether that's a hydroelectric dam or drilling for oil or whatever, all financed through American banking systems. This is all evidenced in a book called The Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. I would recommend that reading to everybody. But when it comes to the war, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and the war in Iraq, when we were trying to preserve the Petro-Dollar, I'm good with that. I have no problem with putting boots on the ground to preserve our way of life. However, with that said, I do have a problem when we extend the wars solely for the benefit of the military-industrial complex. I say this because our current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Raising Kane, he told Trump in December 2018, when Trump visited Al-Sadad Air Base in Iraq, that he could win the war against ISIS in a week if he were just be allowed to fight, rather than the 2 years, according to the military advisors. He said, and I'm going to quote here, "We're only hitting them from the temporary base in Syria, but if you give us permission, we could hit them from the back, from the side, from all over. From the base you're standing on right now, sir, they won't know what the hell hit them." The fact that we extend these wars, we put boots on the ground and secure an area and then extend the wars for the benefit of the Halliburtons and the Baker Hughes of the world, or for the military-industrial complex, which is everything from Raytheon to General Dynamics to Boeing to Lockheed Martin, that are building missiles and bombs and ammunition and tanks and everything else that supports the military. When we extend these wars not for just 1 or 2 years, but decades, think about this. We won World War II against two of the world's superpowers, Germany and Japan, in 3.5 years, from December 1941 until August 1945. We built the largest military in the history of the world. We had over 50 aircraft carriers by the end of that war. And you're telling me we can't beat a bunch of people running around in a desert in 18? Seriously? It was done for pure economics. And we were putting lives, our sons and daughters' lives, in jeopardy for the benefit of the banks and the military-industrial complex and the oil companies such as Halliburton, SLB, Baker Hughes, National Oil Well, Varco, etc. In fact, General Eisenhower, in his farewell speech, warned the Americans about the dangers of the United States military-industrial complex and being pulled into wars to support it. That is completely unacceptable. And so help me God, if I ever run for office, I want an investigation into the grift and the kickbacks to our politicians that would allow them to vote to continue this shit for almost 20 years. So with all that said, I will go back on topic where I keep going off on these tangents. The politicians need to tell the truth to the American public. Tell them the truth. I believe that the American people would support putting boots on the ground to preserve our way of life. However, I do not think that they're going to agree with protracting the wars for the sake of profits. And that is where I think the core of the problem is in Washington. They're getting kickbacks from the military-industrial complex, the oil and gas businesses, and the banks that are financing it all to stretch out these wars in perpetuity so that they can line their pockets. As to our way of life and preserving it, I think that's a justifiable cause. I think everyone can agree that they don't want to be living in grass huts with mud floors. They want to drive a nice car and have a TV and their cell phone in their hands and air conditioning and food in plenty at a grocery store that we're accustomed to, rather than having to till the earth to harvest it. You know, there's so many people in this country that think that the rest of the world lives like we do. I got news for you. I've been to 23 countries. This is heaven on earth. I've seen some shit that'll turn your hair white in other countries. Okay? Be grateful you live in this country. You should get down on your hands and knees and thank God every day that you were blessed to be part of the 4% of the world population that lives here. And stop taking it for granted and abusing the system or demanding more from the system when you already have more than 96% of the world. Seriously, be grateful. Hell, even the poorest amongst us are richer than a majority of the world. You have cable TV, you have air conditioning and cell phones, you have food aplenty. Hell, there are YouTube videos of immigrants that have come to this country that wept at the sight of the food inside of a Walmart. Okay, deep breath. Whew. Let's get back on topic. Okay, let's see. Where did I leave off? Oh yeah, the policy of the United States in the Middle East. Think about it in terms of the Petro-Dollar. What's going on over there that endangers that system and thereby endangers the American financial system? And then it all starts making sense. So right there it is. Wars fought for the preservation of the United States dollar and our monetary system. Now there's more to this history. We can actually go back to the creation of the Federal Reserve in February of 1913 and how money actually influenced World War One and World War Two. World War One was an interesting story. It is actually detailed in G. Edward Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, as well as World War II is detailed in The Creature from Jekyll Island. So I'm not going to take away from his excellent works. I may summarize it for you in a future video, but I'm already looking at over 15 minutes just on the Bretton Woods Agreement and the Petro-Dollar, and the wars that those created. I would advise you to go read that book. It is a page turner. It's like reading a whodunit. I may do a whole podcast on just the wars of the 20th century and how it ties back to money and power. World War One and World War Two, right, is detailed out in G. Edward Griffin's book. But then Korea and Vietnam are actually detailed out in Fletcher Prouty's book. And you probably wonder who Fletcher Prouty is. If you ever saw the movie JFK, the guy who played Donald Sutherland, who wouldn't say who he was, that was Fletcher Prouty. And he actually wrote 2 books on his deathbed that I'm telling you, it is shocking what he reveals in those books, and the undercurrents and the shadow governments, and how they manipulate wars for profit. It is, I'm telling you, it is second only, if not more shocking than The Creature from Jekyll Island, was Fletcher Prouty's books. He couldn't talk about what he knew when he was younger, but on his deathbed, he wanted the world to know the truth. He was an eyewitness to a lot of it. So it is eyewitness history. And damn. And I want to make sure that I am quoting my sources here. Unlike a lot of the people who like to comment and just express opinions, I'm footnoting this one because there's a lot of facts and details here. And I want to make sure I'm giving credit to the source material that I got it from. And by the way, all of this is verifiable. Go on ChatGPT or Grok, and it'll tell you just about everything I'm telling you here, but not in you have to put the pieces together, right? This is a giant jigsaw puzzle, and to my knowledge, this podcast is the only source I've ever heard that compiled all of this evidence into a single place. So with that said, let me give the credit to the books. I've mentioned a couple of these already, but The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin, JFK, the CIA, Vietnam, and the Plot to Assassinate by L. Fletcher Prouty, and The Secret Team, that's another book he's written. I haven't gotten to this one yet, but it's on my to-do. The Secret Team, the CIA and its allies in control of the United States and the world, Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins, and The Medusa Files by Craig Roberts. Last but not least, there's a book called Almost a Spy by Charles Petty, and it's subtitled, says, by an American, the former political section head Minister of Information in Kuwait. All of these books are absolute must-reads for any American that wants to know what the hell is going on. You have this itch under your skin. You know something's wrong, but you can't put your finger on it. I've just pointed the finger. And my wife tells me to be careful. She's afraid that I'm going to be arrested for putting this information out. Our government likes to silence voices that speak truth. Like the 56 alleged suicides tied to a single Democratic family, the Clintons. You start threatening their power, and people start ending up dead. So anyways, I guess that's the end of this one. I thank you for listening. If you have comments or questions, shoot over to the YouTube video. It will be linked in the description to this podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube, put it in the comments below, and I will answer your questions to the best of my ability. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again. If you're kind and courteous and genuinely inquisitive in your comments, I'll go above and beyond to answer your questions to your satisfaction. If you're going to be a dick, I can be a dick too. So Be nice, right? Be courteous. And be sure to like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. And I would ask that you share this podcast / YouTube video with any veteran of Desert Shield, Desert Storm, or the War on Terror. A lot of them question why they fought, and this recording answers a lot of those questions. Anyways, that's it for this one. This is SeaBear, out.